Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. We are moving forward. This is Chapter 18. The Victorians make the modern. So the Victorians come from Queen Victoria's age, the late 1800s. But we are going to move into the modern world with the 1900s and the Industrial Revolution. All right. Sorry. Excuse me. Sorry. All right. So this is an ad for a department store. You can see how busy it is, but it's got clothing and furniture and groceries and dry goods and meats. They also have services including banking, barbers, manicures, employment bureaus, restaurants, law offices, doctors and dentist office. So basically they're offering one-stop shopping for everything. This is a Chicago department store in 1893. It features pictures of well-dressed middle and upper-class clientele, both men, all men, women, and children. Depicts the department store as palatial and elaborately decorated, reinforcing the notion that they are for well-to-do customers. You see people shopping and receiving services, but also eating together, socializing, and browsing. The department stores are presented as community gathering spaces for the affluent. So the fancies. All right, so let's look at commerce and culture. All right, so your consumer spaces, they're generally male-centered new businesses, changing their atmosphere to attract who else but women? Often the ones spending the money. Okay, so you get the circus. The circus comes in P.T. Barnum, so Barnum and Bailey's, the greatest show on earth. They used the rail system for a traveling circus. They focused on family entertainment, emphasized refined female entertainers to encourage women's tennis, promised middle-class parents that circus would teach children courage and promote outdoor activity and exercise. So they were trying to get all parts of the market. Railroad companies trying to make their customers comfortable with modern amenities. They fitted their rail cars with carpets and upholstery and woodwork. And they had first-class ladies' cars, which were opulent. They soon become sites of struggle for racial equality. They do prohibit African Americans from sharing the space. So with that in mind, you get Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. So it's a Supreme Court decision that declares that separate but equal facilities for African Americans on railroad cars and other public facilities do not violate the 14th Amendment. Basically, it is a case about equality on the rail lines in Louisiana. And honestly, that's not very important to remember. The separate but equal is what's important to remember, and it changes kind of the track of how things go for the next 70 years. Because it takes till Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1960s, the 1960s, to turn this over. So this is where you get segregation in restrooms and public spaces, on cars, on buses, on rails, on buses, that kind of stuff. So this basically places a stamp of approval on segregation. The Plessy decision allows Jim Crow laws to stand and expand dramatically. So it is a huge, huge case for that reason, really having nothing to do with what the actual case is. All right. So we have the rise of sports in our commerce and culture here. You have muscular Christianity. This is introduced in Boston in 1851. This is going to be what else other than the YMCA? So it was the first promoter of physical fitness in the U.S., adapted from a British model and advocated vigorous exercise for young men. It combined evangelism, with gyms and athletic facilities where men could make themselves clean and strong. YMCA stands for Young Men's Christian Association. Or Christian, I think Association. I'll double check that. But it is definitely Young Men's Christian. 1900 to 1917 developed an industrial program to foster loyalty to companies and a content workforce. Serving the company teams instilled pride and teamwork. So, searching for winter activities in the 1890s, YMCA instructors invented basketball and volleyball. Some negotiations arose on whether the working class could be participants. So trying to kind of foster togetherness, they put together all these company leagues. And that's something in a lot of big companies, they have stuff like that today, even company games and whatnot. So if you ever wonder where basketball and volleyball came from, the YMCA. All right, so baseball developed before the Civil War. It spread in popularity during the war and becomes a professional sport after the war. The National League was launched in 1876. The first World Series was held in 1903, and employers encouraged company teams. You do have Negro leagues that come up. At the turn of the century, most black players were barred from professional teams. They led to the development of segregated teams. Desegregation does not come till after World War II. And then we have football. Controversial sport grew out of the Ivy League colleges in the 1880s. The game was violent. It's still violent today, they just wear more pads. 6-player deaths in 1908. Eventually, rules were put in place to protect players. Professional teams developed in Pittsburgh, Green Bay, and Chicago. So, beginnings of football. All right. The great outdoors. All right, so 1890, you have 10 million bicycles sold in the United States as Americans begin to reject Victorian culture as stuffy and claustrophobic, revolted by heading outdoors. It also becomes an important mode of transportation, especially in cities. As far as preservation goes, you have the national and state governments that are making provisions for land to be set aside for preservation and recreation, extended the reach of the national forest. Wilson creates the National Park Service in 1960. The Lacey Act established federal penalties for selling specified birds, animals, and plants. The Antiquities Act in 1906 allowed the president to set aside objects of historic and scientific interest as national monuments. Debate ensued over the use of natural resources, example timber, from monuments versus parks, which were protected. You have our environmentalist, John Muir, who's an inventor from Wisconsin. He founded the Sierra Club in 1892 for exploring and preserving the Pacific coast. Protection of wildlife was encouraged. You have Audubon societies that are called for protection of bird species. And new laws against hunting game caused controversy. Because that was a big sport. Even Teddy Roosevelt, who was a big deal at that time period, was a big game hunter. John Muir, on a side note, if you ever go to San Francisco and have time to kind of travel the area, there's the Muir Woods, it's a redwood forest, which is pretty amazing. Those trees are massive. All right. So the average American family, so the family size decreases after the Civil War. In 1800, women gave birth to an average of 7 children. That doesn't mean 7 lived. That's how many they gave birth to. In 1900, the average was 3.6. Farming families need a lot of children to help with the work. However, families in industrial society limited their family size and concentrated their resources on helping the children to succeed in the market economy. Couples married at older ages. They tried to suppress fertility by nursing, condoms, and diaphragms. Vulcanization of rubber makes these things possible, so it gives them ability for birth control. 1873, you have the Comstock Act. Anthony Comstock secured a federal law banning obscene materials from the United States mail. It was applied to any information about sex and birth control. It was supported by those who feared the rising tide of pornography, sexual information, and contraceptives made available by industrialization. So, basically, censorship. Not wanting to get it out to the public, because how you get things to the public is through the mail, essentially. So, that makes a big problem. Alright. You start to get the rise of education in the United States. So education is critical for affluent boys preparing for professional employment. Affluent daughters were encouraged to attend school to gain employable skills, just in case. Technical and business educations were important for urban and rural people. Sorry, it's very early in the morning. I think I said that last week, too. Anyway, by 1900, 71% of Americans between 5 and 18 years of age attended school. Curriculum included literature, composition, history, geography, biography, mathematics, ancient and modern languages, and athletics. You had nowhere near that amount of kids in school prior to 1900, so that's a big increase. Because there's no laws, there's no nothing making kids go to school. By 1920, approximately 8% of youth were attending public universities. State schools emphasized technical training, while private colleges pioneered liberal arts. Let's see. You have the Tuskegee Institute in 1881, the Tuskegee Airmen, that's where they come from. It was established by Booker T. Washington. It was a school for industrial education. Educated women for nursing and teaching and men for trades. Washington was criticized by civil rights leaders for refusing confrontation with whites over the race issue, focusing instead on training wage earners for economic success. Women, not easy to get them educated either. In the Northeast and South, women attended single-sex schools or teacher training colleges. Vassar College, 1861, sought to give women an education equal to that of males. The founding of Smith, Wellesley, and other colleges followed. Some feared that education would unsex young women. Vassar included a focus on keeping young women healthy and strong, combat public criticism of education for women. Midwest and West offered public educational universities. So in the East, not really into the co-ed stuff, but out in the West, it becomes more of a necessity. Fewer people, less places. All right. So now we're going to move into kind of rights. So maternalist ideal justified women's work in the public sphere based on women's special talents, such as mothers and Christians. You get the Women's Christians Temperance Union, and remember, temperance is kind of not wanting alcohol. And you can see the picture right here. I hereby solemnly promise God helping me to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, including wine, beer, and cider, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use of and traffic in the same. So this is the Women's Christians Temperance Union pledge. This would be their card that they got. It was founded in 1874, led by Frances Willard. He advocated the prohibition of liquor, put women at the forefront of public reform. Willard's motto was home protection. The WCTU began first national movement against domestic violence. They brought together people from urban and rural areas. They founded soup kitchens and free libraries. They investigated prisons, advocated for an 8-hour workday and an end to child labor. They called for women's suffrage. They supported the Prohibition Party. Early 20th century was reborn in such groups as the Anti-Saloon League. All right. Daughters of the American Revolution from 1890 excluded. Who do you think? Of course, black women. The United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1894 was founded to extol the South's lost cause. So, the American Revolution, you have the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Ida B. Wells organized one woman campaign against lynching in 1892, but does not get much support. The National Association of Colored Women showed that black women shared with white women the determination to carry domesticity into the public sphere. Women's Convention of the National Baptist Church in 1900 was the largest black women's group. So, you have women, both white and black, trying to try and change things. Let's see. Rival suffrage organizations reunited as the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890 and won full ballots of women in Colorado in 1893, in Idaho and Utah in 1896. By 1913, most women living west of the Mississippi have the vote. Anti-suffragist organized National Association opposed to women's suffrage in 1911. And by the 1910s, some women began to call for women's full political, economic, and social equality. The Heterodoxy Club in 1912 organized in New York City for intellectuals, journalists, and labor organizers who supported women's rights and liberation. They called themselves feminists. All right. So you can see on this map when everybody kind of gained voting rights, or women, I mean. So in the purple, you have Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado. So these are going to be all the earliest ones before 1900. And part of the reason they got the right to vote so early is because a lot of women were landowners in those areas, and they were decision makers. 1910 to 1918, you get all the rest of the West Coast and some more Midwest states. By 1919, you have partial suffrage in all of the kind of pinky states, and then of course, when the 19th Amendment comes in, the rest of them gain their rights. But you can definitely see where the more conservative part of the country is definitely on the east. All right. Darwinism. Gotta love me some Darwinism. So, in 1859, the book On the Origin of Species by Darwin, it argues that all creatures struggle to survive, but some are born with mutations that make them better fit for their environment. And this is the theory of natural selection. These characteristics then become dominant in future generations. So how does this relate to social Darwinism? Sorry. It's an elaborate theory developed by Herbert Spencer, who's a British philosopher. He basically said humans had advanced through competition and survival of the fittest. William Graham Sumner, who's a sociologist at Yale, claimed the wealthy were the fittest. Sumner's views were controversial, and critics argued that Spencer and others, including French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, were making excuses for the excess of industrial society. And I'll tell you, Carnegie was a social Darwinist. He believed in survival of the fittest, and so when he started giving away all of his money, he only gave it to places that would help people better themselves. Libraries, universities, that kind of stuff. You have eugenics, which is a science of human breeding that argued mentally deficient people should be prevented from reproducing. It proposed sterilization laws. Many associated mental deficiencies with so-called lower races, which led to increased discrimination against people of Asian, African, and Native American descent. Alright. So, over to art. So we've got science, now we have art. You have naturalism, suggests that human beings were victims of forces beyond their control. Examples include Stephen Crane's Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, is a book. Jack London's story, The Law of Life, and Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Modernism rejects traditional canons of literary taste, focuses on the subconscious and primitive mind. It sought to overturn convention and tradition. It included religious skeptics and atheists, questioned progress, and some photographers argue that their true representations made painting obsolete. But painters start to invent their own forms of realism. The Armory Show, 1913, introduced America to modern art, including Cubism. Our friend Pablo Picasso. It was met with both controversy and fascination. So this was definitely a very confusing art to most Americans who were used to realism. You see this picture right here on the right. Excuse me. It is a painting that depicts women dancing without clothing. Their mode of dancing is not formal, and this is not a traditional painting. It's more of a modernist painting. Many people at the time would have found this painting likely shocking because of the nudity and the primitive forms of dancing presented, and just that general style. It just wasn't done. All right, so religion. So you get a large number of Catholic and Jews that are coming into the United States in the late 1800s. And it kind of leads to the question of whether immigrants should adapt their faiths to American Protestantism. So can you imagine, we already want them to come in and speak English and be American, but to ask them to change their religions, it's a little much. Connection to the church decreases because of harshness of industrial society. the immigrants, immigrant Catholics established parishes based on ethnicity. So you have the Irish Catholic Church, the Italian Catholic Church, the Polish Catholic Church, etc. Native-born American Jews embraced Reform Judaism, abandoning such religious practices as keeping a kosher kitchen and conducting services in Hebrew. Some Jews founded Orthodox synagogues. So when you wonder why there's different levels of Judaism, this contributes to it. Let's see, in 1916, Protestants still were a majority in the United States, but facing increasing political pressure from large numbers of Catholics. Protestants worked to evangelize those who were uncommitted to religion through social gospel. They founded the YMCA, revealed faith through their public welfare and social justice efforts, introduced the United States and British organization, the Salvation Army, still in place today. You also have your fundamentalists. These are conservatives who were concerned about the rising secularism of the country. A series of Bible conferences at Niagara Falls were held between 1876 and 1897. It reaffirmed the literal truth of the Bible and the certain damnation of those not born again in Christ. It used revival meetings. Billy Sunday helped bring evangelism into the modern era and held revivals to reconnect Americans with Protestant religion. It was very, very popular. Okay, I think that is all we are going to talk about today. Actually, I know, because this is the last slide in the PowerPoint. So anyway, I hope that helped and that you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening. See you soon.